Yaps. It's in the name. Archaeological evidence just destroyed the 1500 BCE Vedas timeline. They're probably much older. That's gonna be my guess.
It talks about the Indus Valley civilization, and one thing immediately stood out. The Saraswati River is no longer described as a myth. It's
What?
now classified as a real river system.
Oh.
And trust me, that's a big shift. But the dates attached to the Veda is still the same, around 1500 BC. So if this book had been written in the 19th century, that would make sense. Back then, we didn't know
Saraswati is real? I thought it was too.
We didn't know about the painted grayware, ochre-colored pottery, or northern black polished ware. There was no large-scale excavations, no carbon
Why
dating,
not?
no satellite mappings. But today, we are more than 200 years later. We have thousands of excavated sites,
I really like this guy, by the way.
clear archaeological sequences, and dates going back 10,000 years.
Wow.
So it's reasonable to ask, is it the time to re-examine those old dates?
Yes.
In the last part,
And the pyramids.
we did something very specific. We didn't talk about gods or mythology. We looked only at society as it was described in the Vedas. And what emerges is a clear internal progression.
People said it was a myth when mentioned in the Mahabharata. No, I definitely believe that the Saraswati River was a real river system. And just like in Africa, the desert used to be one of the largest lakes. The earth, how it is now, was not the same place or location it was 15,000 years ago. It was basically a whole new game. There was so many updates ago, so many patches ago that we can't even fathom that it was the same game. But it was indeed the same game. We're just playing a much more refined, patched, updated version of it. You know what I'm saying?
Rural communities,
You picking up what I'm putting down?
System, and eventually a mature civilization. And this isn't unique to India. It's the same pattern that we see in Sumer, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica. Civilizations, they don't appear fully formed. They grow. And that brings us to the real question.
You know what's interesting is over in like Europe and India, you guys had domesticatable animals, which really allowed for labor to be delegated to those animals, which allowed for civilizations to be propped up. If you look over at over here in the western side of the world with like the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Native Americans, they really didn't have these complex societies. They really didn't have any domesticatable animals.
If the Vedas preserve the memory of a society evolving this way, does that society actually
think,
fit
Arma?
into a 1500
Really?
BCE world? And if it doesn't, then where does it belong? In
I
this
could-
part,
I
we are
could
not defending theories
kind
or
of see
forcing
that.
timelines. We are going to test the placement itself using archaeology. So let's start with the ground. And I don't want to bore you with archaeological lectures, but one thing is non-negotiable. Whenever a civilization evolves from pastoral life to settled villages to urban systems, we find material evidence. Tools, potteries, architecture, sometimes script. And when people migrate, we find that cultural transfer, or at the very least, some memory of it. So if you are testing the Aryan invasion or Aryan migration, whatever term you prefer, the first place to look at is not linguistics, it's archaeology. And the problem is, the first debate in archaeology is almost never about evidence. It's about the absence of evidence. It doesn't matter whether you are on social media, mainstream media, or in academic forums. The Aryan migration is almost always supported by one argument: the absence of horses and chariots in India before 1500 BC. And here's where it gets strange. Nowhere else in the world is a civilization defined by a single animal. Not Egypt, not Mesopotamia, and not China. That's historically and academically accepted, except when you're talking about India. So let's address this very quickly. Horses do not preserve well in Indian archaeological records, and that's because of climate and soil conditions. And we have discussed this multiple times before, so I will keep it very brief. Even if horses existed, their bones would not survive, period. Which means something very simple.
Interesting. That's actually this is why he's a good archaeologist.
If an object
He's probably true on this. I know fossils are very hard. Like, it's very hard to actually keep bones and preservations. Like, everything will decompose, break down, and go back to the universe.
cannot survive, it cannot be used as a primary evidence. You don't look for what cannot last. You look for what does. And what survives almost forever in material culture is pottery, tools, metallurgy, and settlement patterns. So now, first let's look at the story of Aryans. Whether it starts in the steppe, Central Asia, or the Caucasus, it actually doesn't matter. What matters is, did these cultures have a distinct archaeological identity? Did they make their own pottery? Did they use specific tools? Was there a characteristic metal tradition? Because if they migrated to India and composed the Vedas, then that material identity should appear here. And we will also see if they had any technology. Was it advanced than the Sub-Sindhu region, which is the land of 7 rivers? In today's geography, that includes Punjab on both sides of the borders, Haryana, part of Rajasthan, Sindh, Balochistan, Gilgit-Baltistan, and Gandhar. To the east, it extends to Yamuna and Ganga. This entire geography is described in the Vedas, as we discussed in the last video. So if the Aryans arrived and composed the Vedas here, this is exactly where their cultural memory should appear. But does it? Well, do one thing. Google it. Ask ChatGPT. Open your textbooks and look for if there is any archaeological evidence of the steppe or Central Asian Aryans that was introduced to India, because there is not a single piece of archaeological evidence showing steppe material culture entering India. There is no pottery, no tools, no hybrid traditions. And let me simplify this further. Now let's stop circling around the theories and put the timeline on table. The cultures usually are linked to the Aryan invasion are the steppe cultures, which are Simtasha and Antonovo. They appear around 2100 to 1800 BC. And that date matters because by this point, the Indian subcontinent is not starting a civilization. It is already deep inside one. So let's begin
Interesting.
with what steppe culture actually brings. Their pottery is known as incised courseware. It is thick-walled, mostly handmade or made on a slow-turning wheel. Their pottery is fired at lower temperatures. And the decoration that you use, well, that's straight lines, simple cuts. Something like scratched into a surface or scribbling into a surface. They have no record of kilns, no standard shapes, and no mass production. So in short, this is a primitive pottery. Now place that next to India. At Bhirana, as early as 7500 BCE, pottery already shows control. It doesn't have perfection yet, but yes, control. And by 3000 BC,
So how far advanced was India and like Egypt during this time? What?
during the Harappan phase, pottery is wheel-turned, thin-walled, and fired in controlled kilns up to 1800 degrees Celsius. So by 2600 BC, we are talking about an industrial complex of pottery. And that technology never disappeared from the subcontinent. And now we reach the critical period, ochre color pottery, which appears around 2000 to 1500 BC. This is exactly the time window repeatedly cited for the Aryan invasion or migration. So if a steppe population entered India during this period, this is exactly where their material should appear. But what do we see instead? OCP is also not primitive. It is wheel-turned. It shows fire control, same as Indus Valley. It shows continuity of ceramic knowledge developed over millennia. This is Indian pottery evolving from the earlier traditions. There is no replacement, no intrusion, no hybridization with steppes. The sophistication, it does not drop. It continues and it evolves. After this, we see painted graveware dated to 1200 to 600 BC. Again, wheel-turned, controlled firing, design discipline. So this is also not a society that is building.
I strongly believe there's a void in history like in One Piece. Those civilizations being all ancient ones. I think it's hard to argue against you. I completely agree. I think there's definitely giant holes in our history that we just conveniently overlook, and we're like the Mayan and the Aztecs. They're even in their own language, they don't talk about them building those pyramids or building the infrastructure, the archaeology that they're at. They said that they found it, and in fact that was the birthplace of the gods. You know, like what? And then you have Egypt, where the further back you go, the more advanced their society and infrastructure gets. Like, and now with India too, how India's always kind of been isolated. You know, the Roman Empire never invaded India. The Mongols never invaded India. So India's had this weird, almost isolation from the outside empires for such a long time.
From collapse. It is refining the existing technology. And the ceramic lineage that begins around 7500 BC in India, it never breaks. Even if you believe the Indus city declined, the technology does not reset. It evolves. And now let's look at metallurgy. During the same period around 2500 BC to 1900 BC, we have Sinoli, copper helmets, shields, antenna swords, wheeled chariots. And these are not symbolic objects. These are manufactured weapons. And they require metallurgical knowledge, casting control, design intent. At this exact time, steppe metallurgy is still limited to basic.
He does.
They are using socketed.
I like this guy. We've seen his videos in the channel a long time ago. He does great jobs breaking down archaeology. He's like the Indian Graham Hancock.
And simple bronze forms. They don't have any sophisticated weapon system, no industrial metal use. And this comparison, well, it's not close. By the time steppe culture even begins to appear, India has already had settled agriculture, ceramic industry, complex metallurgy and organized settlement life for more than 5,000 years. And this gap never closes in archaeology. Not in 2000 BC, not in 1500 BC, not even later. From the Indus Valley through late Harappan reorganization, through ochre colored pottery, to painted graveware, all the way to the Mauryan Empire. There is not a single archaeological layer in India that shows steppe material culture. No incised courseware, no steppe tools, no steppe metallurgy, and no hybrid phase. Archaeology does not erase entire culture. So when people move, material memory moves with them. Here it doesn't. And that leads us to one unavoidable conclusion. A culture that is 5,000 years behind in technology development, that had never appeared in India in Indian archaeological records, and that never interrupts India's continuous material evolution, cannot be the author of a Vedic civilization. Not at 1500 BC, not after the Indus world. Which means the problem is no longer theoretical. The placement itself has
Raj, you're not
and
wrong.
has shown that steppe culture never enters India. But there is still one argument that people still fall back on. BMAC. The
What's
idea is
that?
simple, that the steppe didn't come straight into India. They stopped in Central Asia first, in the Bacteria Margiana archaeological complex, and then moved south. So before we move on, we need to test that bridge as well. Because BMAC, it is not hypothetical. It is a real archaeological culture dated roughly from the late 3rd millennium BCE into the mid 2nd millennium BC. So if BMAC was the staging ground of the steppe migration into India, then one thing must be true. We should find clear steppe material culture inside BMAC. So BMAC should have steppe pottery, tools, metallurgical traditions. But when we look at the actual excavations, something unexpected happens. We don't see a steppe package moving south. Instead, what we see is Indus material moving north. Indus seals appear at major BMAC sites like
Whoa.
Gonur Tepe. Indus-style objects and materials appear in the Oxus region of BMAC. And further north, we find entire Indus
Like, look at this, man. This is crazy.
linked settlement in Shotughai. This is not a casual trade. Trade leaves objects, but settlements leave presence. And the timing matters. Mature Harappan culture peaks between 2600 and 1900 BC. BMAC flourishes later than this, and into the period when the West itself begins to take shape. Which means the archaeological signal we actually see is not steppe to India. What we see is India to Central Asia. So what that implies for Indo-Iranian history is important, but we are not answering that here. Right now, we are doing something simpler. We are testing a date. So if migration didn't take place in India during the Vedic timeline of 1500 BC, then the only thing left to test is India itself. The moment we try to place the Rig Vedic world at 1500 BC, we run into two immediate problems. The first is Saraswati River. At 1500 BC, it does not exist as a living river system. Not in geology, not in archaeology, it just stays in memory. But let's park Saraswati for now. Even without touching it, the second problem is bigger. Archaeology. So if the Rig Vedic world really belongs to 1500 BCE, then the society described in the hymns should match what we actually find on ground at that time. So what kind of society does Rig Veda describe? The economy is not settled. Cattle are everything. They are wealth, payment, the price in conflict, and recovery of cattle is celebrated, remembered, and sung. This is not an agricultural surplus economy. This is not a landlocked village economy. The early Vedic hymns are showing a pastoral world where movement still matters. And now let's look at what actually was happening in the Sub-Sindhu region
Interesting. That's interesting.
about 1900 BC,
That is domesticatable animals. That's what I was talking about at the very beginning of this.
when the Indus urban phase begins to change. According to archaeology, the civilization doesn't disappear, but it changes forms. Large cities are no longer built. Massive central
Yo, what's up,
planned
Omni?
urban centers, they fade away. Long distance trade networks weaken. But this is the part that matters. People do not become pastoral again. They do not abandon agriculture. They do not start moving seasonally with herds. They do not reorganize into mobile clans. Instead, they settle into smaller and permanent villages. Agriculture, it continues. We find barley, wheat, millets, and pulses in use. And if you remember the old video, the part 1, then Rig Vedic society was only using barley. Rest of the material, including wheat, millets, and pulses, it appears in the Shukla Yajurved, which is the later Vedic phase. So crop diversity, it increases after the collapse of Indus Valley. It is not decreasing. So this already places us far from the Rig Vedic economy, where Yavar dominates and cattle remain central. Settlements after the Indus phase are fixed. Houses are permanent. Villages remain in the same location for generations. Land matters more than herds. Grain storage continues as well. The huge centralized green trees of the Indus Valley, they disappear. But storage as a practice does not. It moves to the household level. Pets, rooms, local storage. Pottery does not regress. ceramic traditions
That's a really cool find.
evolve out of the Harappan foundation. Wheel turn pottery
Arma,
continues.
that's
Fire
actually
control continues.
Raji,
Design
that's sick.
knowledge is not lost. Craft production also continues. Bead making traditions survive. So we even see early experimentation with glass. And metalwork, it does not reset either. Copper and bronze tools remain in local use. Local metallurgical knowledge survives, even as large workshops disappear. So what actually collapses? It's not the culture or skill or memory. What collapses is the scale. And this is where a simple human analogy helps. When a large, complex civilization comes under stress, like climate, trade, disruption, uncertainty, the people who have the resources, they move. Merchants move. Administrators move. Those who can afford to leave, they leave. But craftsmen, they don't migrate easily. Pottery stays, metalwork stays, bead makers stay. They carry the knowledge with them locally from generation to generation. This is exactly what we see archaeologically. Monumental architecture, well, it fades. State level coordination, that also fades. But everyday life, it doesn't change. It continues. And this distinction matters because once a society becomes permanent, settled, agriculture based, and village center, it will never revert to a pastoral
Sorry, boys, I gotta do some work in the background.
cattle currency pastoral world. And the post-Indus archaeology records show continuity of the same settled life. No one in archaeology is returning to Rig-Vedic pastoralism. So the Rig-Vedic society does not appear after the Indus cities. It does not appear in the late Harappan phase. It does not appear in the post-urban village horizon. And when we move further forward in time, well, the fit becomes even worse because the next phase we see is not pastoral. It is territorial. From 1500 BC onwards, the archaeological picture becomes even cleaner. There is no longer a world in transition. It is a world that has chosen permanence. Agriculture is fully developed. Land, not cattle, is the primary unit of survival. And when we see the OCP culture, we see PGW culture, which emerges around 1200 BC and spread across Ganga and Yamuna belt. Everything remains the same because PG is not pastoral. It belongs to sedentary society, people living in fixed locations, cultivating land, organizing territory. And around 1000 to 800 BC, something new appears. Political geography changes. We begin to see janpads, territorial units tied to land, boundaries and controls by 6000 BC. These grow into Mahajanpads. That is fundamentally a different world altogether. So now the power is measured by territory. Economy is based on agriculture and taxation. Society is organized around villages and administration. So the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The Vedic society described in the Rig Veda cannot be 1500 BC, and it cannot belong to the centuries after that. Because once society becomes fully settled, agriculturally locked, territorially locked.
That's what he's saying is that the Mahabharata, the Vedas, and the stories were not completely
It
accurate.
does not revert to pastoral cattle lever currency world. So this door is closed. And now we are left with one direction to look, backwards. Either the Vedas were composed during the Sindhu Saraswati civilization or before it, or they are preserving the memory of society that was actually becoming a civilization. Those are the only options left. And now finally, we can ask the real question. If not 1500 BC, then when does the archaeological record actually make sense? And that's where the real investigation begins.
I really feel like it's so much older than what we think. But I don't understand why everyone still thinks the Rig Veda is the only 10 mandalas as we know now. There are some surviving texts from a huge collection which were lost. And I think this to be true of a lot of old religions, a lot of old cultures where it's just like there's a lot of information that we just don't know, and we conveniently look over the holes in our own history and speak with such certainty.